Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another speaker in our Curious Minds series here at Lone Star College-Kingwood on this beautiful Friday afternoon. And my name is John Barr, and I'm the chair of this committee that invites authors to campus. And we're very excited about today's talk. Let me start by introducing our speaker for the day. This is a part of our what used to be called our Writers, Speakers, and Ideas series, but we've changed that to Curious Minds, where we invite authors to campus, or at least temporarily, virtually to campus, to speak about their books. And you can see a few pictures here of various individuals that we've had on campus. And eventually we will move back to that venue, but for today we are virtual. And today we have on hand Ryan Bourne to speak about his book, Economics in One Virus. Our series is premised on a simple idea. And that simple idea is that talking about books is as important educationally as are the books and the subjects themselves. And our procedures for today are really very simple, or how we're going to conduct this today, now that I've introduced the series. After that, Ryan will talk for 45 minutes, and then we will take questions and answers afterwards. So what are some of the questions that he's likely to address in this talk today? How might economics, ideas, and thinking have helped improve policy in the pandemic? That's one, and be thinking about that as he speaks. Secondly, how might we value any human lives saved by government regulations? Thirdly, how might price controls worsen shortages and crises? What do economists mean by counterfactual? And how might that thinking have better informed the regulation of COVID-19 tests? And then lastly, and this is my own question, is what did you not only what did you most like about this presentation, but how might it change the way you think about issues in the future? Economic reasoning, so important in our society. So during the Q&A, or during the talk, even think about questions you want to ask and type them in the chat, which is down in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. And after the Q&A or after the talk is over, we'll have student, faculty, staff, and community members ask questions for about 15 to 20 minutes. So Ryan Bourne occupies the R. Evans Scarf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at CATO. He has written on a number of economic issues, including fiscal policy, inequality, minimum wages, infrastructure spending, and rent control. Before joining CATO, Bourne was head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and head of economic research at the Center for Policy Studies, both of which are in the United Kingdom. Bourne has extensive broadcast and print media experience and has appeared on BBC News, CNN, Sky News, CNBC, and Fox Business Network. He writes weekly columns for the Daily Telegraph and a fortnightly column for the UK website Conservative Home. Bourne holds a BA and Masters of Philosophy and Economics from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. So without any further ado, welcome, Ryan.
Well, great. And it's great to be with you guys, albeit virtually. I'd much prefer to be in person, but these things happen. If I start to look like I'm sweating profusely or slightly red, it's because I had the booster shot yesterday and I'm suffering a bit of a mild fever at the moment. So it's not that I don't have confidence in my own presentation and I'm worried about it. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to very briefly explain why I wrote this book, Economics in One Virus. And in doing so, I hope to kind of prove or convince you of two things. The first thing is that economics has an important role to play in understanding the pandemic and the choices that have been made within it. And the second aspect is that from a teaching perspective, this pandemic, I think, is a very effective hook for us to explain or highlight basic economic ideas and principles. So if we can flick on to the next slide. The origin story of this publication begins in early spring last year. I was stuck at home watching New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's press conference on CNN. And as he was defending the lockdown measures he'd imposed on New York State, the governor came out with that immortal line beloved of politicians when he said, "If everything we do saves just one life, I'll be happy." Now, for someone whose job is in the public understanding of economics, I saw that as an opportunity to write about how economists actually think about harnessing what we observe in people's free decisions in their lives to try and put a value on mitigating mortality risks through government regulation. Because, of course, while Cuomo was sympathizing with worried families about their immeasurable losses of their family members, none of us, in fact, live our lives as if we place infinite value on their continuation, nor can we afford to set public policy according to that principle. So I took out a notepad and I planned out an essay to explore that topic, albeit recognizing the need for kind of empathy at a time of very high tensions. Next slide, please. So the very next day, as I was sitting planning to write that essay, a new topic reared its head. Several state governors around the country were actually splitting up businesses into two lists, essential and non-essential designations for the purposes of their state's business shutdowns. Again, while some of these were defensible given the risks of transmission of COVID-19, I thought, as somebody whose job is in the public understanding of economics, it might be worth me writing something about the degree of interconnectedness in a modern economy and how, in fact, it's very difficult for any bureaucrat or government agency to understand the intricate links between suppliers and retailers. So if you think about a supermarket, it's quite interesting to explore how one person's non-essential business might in fact be another essential supplier or important service provider to something that really is essential in our lives. There's since been analysis from economists kind of looking at the variation between designations by state and controlling for a range of factors that actually suggest that an industry's donation to a state governor's campaign led to a roughly 10% increase in the probability an industry would be deemed essential. So again, a very interesting topic from an economic perspective. And from then on, day after day, I felt that there were loads of instances of economics rearing its head in this pandemic and where we could use the pandemic to highlight a basic economic idea or concept. So on the next slide, whether that be the costs and benefits of lockdowns, or the next slide, the debates around mask mandates, where of course public officials early on were worried about shortages or people changing their behavior in a way that would undermine the benefit of a mask. Next slide, please. Or indeed the risks and benefits associated with regulations surrounding COVID testing. So if we go on to the next slide, I think all of these examples speak to a broader truth about what economics really is. If you click on the economics section of any newspaper website, almost all of the stories will be about GDP or unemployment or financial markets. But at its most basic, economics is just the study of human choices, human actions, or behavior in a world of ever-changing constraints. And of course, though first and foremost, the pandemic is a public health crisis, the pervasive disruption it has caused has led to all of us, at an individual level, a government level, a family level, needing to make consequential new decisions about how we live our lives afresh. And making good decisions in that changed environment requires economic thinking. It necessitates thinking about trade-offs. It necessitates considering people's incentives to do particular things or to behave in a particular way. It necessitates considering how to weigh up making decisions in a world of uncertainty, and to think about what we really lose with restrictions or changes to our lives. All of those things really are the essence of economics. And so the implication of that is that when thinking about decisions made in the pandemic, we cannot, just as some people like to say, rely on the science of the disease to guide us, because that doesn't really give us any useful information about the likely effectiveness of a policy, the unintended consequences, or the broader costs and benefits. We need a broader conception or framework of how to weigh up our options. And this, I would argue, is what economics provides. And I hope to talk you through a few examples from the book about how economics might be applied. So next slide, please. Now, as I say, I don't have time to run through all of the examples from the book, but I think we can explore at least 3 or 4 here. So the first one that I want to talk about is how economists might think about the value of lives saved from regulations such as business closures or stay-at-home orders. Because as the next slide shows, in most ordinary day-to-day situations, we as individuals freely decide on the balance of risks we're willing to take when we undertake day-to-day activities. And in doing so, perhaps unknowingly most of the time, we implicitly put values on avoiding death. When we drive on highways, for example, we know we're taking a risk of crashing, but we do it anyway because we weigh up the benefits of getting to our location against that very small risk and the potential cost of crashing. We make judgments on whether to drive that route at that time, given the benefits, as I say, of getting to our destination and engaging in the activity that's at the other end of the journey. Of course, if things change, we might change our mind. If there's some change in the risk or benefits, if roads are icy, for example, or if there's heavy traffic, we might decide that journey at that time is not worth it. But what about situations where government intervention might be justified and the state is imposing safety regulations? When we're trying to work out the costs and benefits of things like government policies that mitigate death risks, how should governments value those deaths avoided? Well, here an economist called Thomas Schelling, who was a Nobel Prize winner, he came up with an innovation because he believed that observing groups' own behavior in labor markets can actually provide us with a reasonable proxy about the value of avoiding things such as death risks from COVID-19. Next slide, please. Oh, we appear to have lost John. Well, I can carry on talking about it. Yeah, next slide, please, John. So, as I say, every day people make decisions. One back, please. Every day people make decisions that reflect how much they value avoiding death. Individuals in hazardous jobs such as mining, or as this famous picture shows, high-rise building projects, are often paid what economists call a compensating differential. That is just a higher wage relative to some similarly skilled job or alternative to compensate them for the additional risks of death or injury that they face at work. And Schelling's great insight was that economists could utilize that information to estimate how much the group in total was willing to accept to bear a specific elevated death risk. And measures of this trade-off between money and risk allow us to then calculate what's known as a value of a statistical life. That really is just how much a group of workers would have to be paid collectively to compensate them for the statistical probability of any one of their group dying. Now, that sounds a mouthful, so perhaps if we could talk through an example, it would make that a bit clearer. So if we go on to the next slide, suppose a group of manufacturing workers in the US, on average, accepted being paid $2,000 extra per person per year to compensate them for an additional death risk of being crushed by a machine, say, at 0.02% uplift in the probability of dying at work. If we divide how much each worker would need to be paid to accept that risk by the uplift in the risk they face, then we get a value of how much the group would accept to avoid the probability of any one death. So in this example, if you divide $2,000 by 0.02% uplift in risk, you get a value of a statistical life of $10 million. Now, it's important to understand and be clear about what that means. It's a reflection of the fact that workers have to be compensated collectively by $10 million in order to be willing to bear that elevated death risk at work, in the sense of the statistical probability that one person would die. It doesn't follow, of course, that an individual would accept $10 million to be killed on the spot. This isn't a value of human life, it's a value of a statistical life based upon the risk that those workers are facing. In short, why this is important is because this value of a statistical life can then be used for quite small risks as a reasonable proxy to tell us the collective value we achieve when we mitigate death risks in other in other areas of life. So if we go on to the next slide, how does this relate to COVID-19? Well, American economist Kit Viscusi has estimated that the actual observed value of a statistical life for small risks at work does tend to be around $10 million in US workplaces. And when you account for the death risks combined with the risk of catching COVID-19, some of those risks for a lot of people across the kind of demographic groups are quite similar in magnitude to some of the risks being assessed in these labour market studies. Now, what does that mean? Well, given COVID-19 regulations theoretically help mitigate the risk of dying from COVID-19 by reducing human contact, economists have sought to estimate the monetary value of the reduction in risks from the COVID-19 restrictions by multiplying the value of a statistical life from those labour market studies by the number of deaths believed to be avoided as a result of the various shutdown measures. So just as an example, I'm not saying these figures are right, but suppose we thought, as some studies have concluded, that the first US lockdowns across the country avoided, say, 50,000 deaths. This 10 million figure, if you believe it and take it at face value, would imply health benefits from reducing death risks from those lockdowns of as much as $500 billion. That's 2.4% of 2019 GDP, a really, really big figure. In fact, some economists have even suggested that the total value of the health benefits from lockdowns might even be double that once one accounts for the mitigation of non-fatality risks. You know, people tend to value avoiding getting sick in the first place. So why does this matter? Because in analysis, we can then compare these calculations of the value of health benefits or purported health benefits of lockdowns, as well as any other benefits, against the multitude of economic costs that a lockdown brings. So in this example, if the economic costs of a given lockdown were less than 500 billion and we were confident of that, those lockdowns would actually pass what economists describe as a simple cost-benefit test. So if we go on to the next slide, the next question to ask, well, are these numbers credible? Because on the face of it, they do seem quite extraordinary. And we might want to question them for a number of reasons. So the first reason is one that you've probably heard most about, which is there's of course been much debate around the epidemiological estimates of how many lives lockdowns actually saved in reality. Why is that? Well, assessing that properly is incredibly difficult because you need what economists describe as an accurate counterfactual to compare the world of lockdowns to. So you have to imagine what would have happened if the state had not imposed these things, and how would people have behaved? Would they have taken extensive voluntary mitigation steps? Would they have avoided people to avoid catching the disease? It's incredibly difficult to say what would have happened with any degree of certainty. You would also, of course, need to define the time period you were assessing carefully, because it's possible that lives saved, or things that look like lives saved by less interaction in the first lockdowns, actually proved to be merely deaths delayed until the economy was reopened and people then engaged in interactions later on. But I'd argue there's perhaps other reasons to doubt the use of these old labour market estimates of the value of a statistical life for considering COVID-19. So the first thing to think about is that the risks of death from COVID-19 vary a lot by demographic group, mainly by age. And the risks of death from COVID-19 are much, much higher for, say, the elderly than anything considered in those studies. Retired people, of course, don't tend to be part of labour market studies anyway. So that makes it quite difficult to ascertain how much older people would in reality be willing to pay, in inverted commas, to mitigate death risks. Evidence suggests too that older people tend to have a lesser willingness to pay to avoid death risks than middle-aged people. So those value of a statistical life estimates might not be quite right given the preferences of the elderly. We might also expect there to be more variation in the preferences of older people about how much they'd be willing to pay or need to be paid to bear death risks than among a group of similar workers. If you ask an elderly relative how much they'd be willing to pay to avoid death for, say, 5 years, I suspect you'd get a wide range of different answers, and a much wider range than if you ask, say, a 40-year-old, a 40-year-old cohort all with the same income, say. And in fact, once one accounts for age, a lot of economists have revised down these value of a statistical life estimates a lot. So one thing that we might do is just account for years of life left. And the average years of life left of somebody who unfortunately passed away with COVID-19 tends to be between 8 and 10 years, but depending on which study you examine. And once you account for that and the demographics of deaths in that first wave, some economists have therefore estimated it would reduce the value of those benefits by two-thirds. So whatever you think about whether these adjustments are justified, clearly economics can play a crucial role in thinking about how we might weigh up the costs and benefits of mitigating mortality risks. And that's really crucial if you want to assess robustly the costs and benefits of things like lockdowns. And thinking about all those different angles and aspects that I've just talked about, and I know I've thrown a lot of different considerations out there, that hasn't even really been well done so far by many economists either. They tend to take very simplistic estimates of the number of lives saved from lockdowns, multiply it by the simple value of a statistical life from existing studies, and just compare it to the losses of GDP. And that's a really inadequate way of thinking about all these different considerations. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I'd argue there are a lot of other issues where a bit of economic understanding goes a long way. So if you think about it, early in the pandemic, we moved from being at work to working from home in many cases for much of the population. We were suddenly told to keep our hands clean and to socially distance. And that led to a massive shift in the demand for products. We saw demand for travel and hospitality collapse, demand for hand sanitizer and masks soar. In other industries, we saw the type of demand change. So commercial toilet paper that is used at work and in environments with lots of people tended to crash, and home use toilet paper, the high quality kind, surged. So if we move on to the next slide and take the example of, say, hand sanitizer, demand took off early on as we were suddenly told that we needed to keep our hands clean to stop the spread of the disease. And basic supply and demand can usually inform us of what would happen when we see such an uplift in demand. Given at that stage there is more demand chasing the same number of goods at the old price, we create very near-term shortages, and as a result of that, sellers realize that they're able to increase prices to reflect the greater willingness to pay for the goods. Now, what happens when that price starts creeping up? It leads to two crucial effects. First of all, the rising price makes some people reconsider whether they really need to buy as much as they thought they would at the old price. So, if you're going into a store to buy a hand sanitizer and you see the price has doubled, you might think, do I really need 2 packets of this stuff, or could I get by with 1 packet at the moment? And the second thing is perhaps more important. the higher price actually provides an incentive for producers to ramp up production because it gives them the financial payoff to pay overtime to workers, to invest in capacity expansions, to run their machines hotter, or else to bring out stuff that they have in warehouses or cupboards and sell the additional stock in markets. So as these two different effects play out, we kind of converge to a new equilibrium, as economists like to call it. Pretty quickly, the incentive embedded within those signals of rising prices, both for consumers and suppliers, leads to the elimination of shortages as the market clears, with more demand being served, albeit at higher prices. The P2 star on that diagram there. And yet, if we go on to the next slide, for months into the pandemic, we didn't see this in many parts of the country. This is a picture from a CVS just opposite me in DC, about 2 months after the lockdown began. Those shelves are where the hand sanitizer used to sit, and as you can see, the shelves were still empty. Now, at the same time, a packet of 24 2-ounce Purell hand sanitizers, usually costing around $10, was selling for $400 in a small market online. So what's going on, and how can we explain these ongoing shortages? If we go on to the next slide, part of the story is no doubt that it takes time to reorient or expand production. As a supplier, when you weren't expecting a huge shift in demand, as the current supply chain crisis is showing, it's incredibly difficult to react very, very quickly when you have massive demand surges. Eventually, of course, we did have a host of new entrants to the market for hand sanitizer, including distilleries who turned to producing it. And of course, since then, we've realized that hand sanitizer was far less important as a way of mitigating the virus. And all this new production today has produced a glut of the stuff such that companies and charities are, in many cases, actually giving it away to schools and universities. But why were the shelves empty for so long? Well, part of the explanation beyond this kind of medium-term story, the fact that it takes companies time to adjust, is that in many ways, both privately and through government, we actually suppressed these normal price signals. And as a result, we were left with shortages for longer than we might otherwise expect. Now, economists have done a lot of work that shows that when emergencies hit, even when goods are in short supply relative to demand, going back to the diagram we just looked at, some major chain stores are actually just simply unwilling to raise prices. And that's because they're worried about the reputational impact of being seen to price gouge and how that might affect their profitability going forwards. If you looked carefully at that picture from CVS that I had up, you can actually see a sticker saying buy one, get 50% off, which of course is a very generous offer for the store when they have none available. But it's not just CVS. One study that looked at prices of face masks sold by third parties on Amazon's marketplace actually found that on average, though prices were about 270% higher than in 2019, which is understandable given the demand surge. Even though that was the case, sellers who'd actually been selling from before the pandemic actually charged just 63% of the price of sellers that entered the face mask market on Amazon Marketplace after the pandemic hit. What does that suggest? Well, that suggests that existing sellers had a reputation to protect and they couldn't jack up prices as high due to fears for what might happen to their reputation if customers notice, because consumers really do notice when a company they've been buying from for a long time suddenly raises their retail prices. In fact, so worried are major companies for their reputation as price gougers that others, such as Walmart, have instead developed mechanisms of getting to supply to areas hit by natural disasters rather than face shortages or raising their prices after, say, hurricanes or tornadoes. They tend to have fancy logistics plans that mean they can ship in stuff from outside of the emergency zone pretty quickly. Now, that works in very localized emergencies that end quickly, but unfortunately, the pandemic has been a much more protracted crisis affecting the whole country. So that partly explains why we saw sustained shortages in certain major stores. But on top of that, most state governments also instituted anti-price gouging legislation that in effect bans or severely curbs the ability of sellers to charge higher than normal prices. Now, the extent and effects of these laws differs by state. In some areas, they introduce just a bunch of uncertainty for sellers by outlawing unconscionable price rises, whatever that means. That introduces a lot of uncertainty about what sellers are and aren't able to charge. In other places like California, there's strict limits of say 10% above the pre-emergency price. But the compounded effect of all of these pieces of legislation is the same. On the margin, they provide a disincentive even for smaller stores to raise prices. Because of either the risk of fines or the risk of prosecutions for doing so. And as a result, we don't get the rationing of goods to those willing to pay most, or the incentives for suppliers to produce more that the basic demand and supply diagram suggested would exist. So if we go on to the next slide, these anti-price gouging laws have therefore in part contributed to sustained shortages of products, which maybe even worsened public health at the time. Why is that? Well, some economists have looked at this and figured out if prices don't adjust to reflect the supply and demand reality, then those lucky enough to find goods like hand sanitizer will tend to over-purchase or hoard the stuff. And as a result of the shortages that result from that, a lot of people who really want hand sanitizer and were willing to pay much more to get it weren't able to. And that means they have to search a lot harder to find it. There was some interesting economic analysis that examined smartphone pings between different smartphones that suggested time spent in stores was actually higher controlling for other factors in states with anti-price gouging laws than those without, which of course is suggestive that consumers are spending more time searching for goods in physical locations as a result of ongoing shortages. Now, this type of legislation can also have bad long-term consequences too. Disasters like pandemics, unfortunately, tend to hit occasionally, and when they do, it would improve our societal resilience if we had some option-ready supply for these types of eventualities, for firms to have made the investments in capacity or logistics such they are ready to serve that much larger market. But by suppressing the price signal this time, measures like anti-price gouging laws or the federal government commandeering factories actually suppresses the incentive to risk investing in that extra capacity in future, because governments aren't going to enable you to sell for rewarding prices to make that big investment that potentially won't provide much of a return in normal times, to make that investment worthwhile. So that's, again, another example of how you can think through the economics of an issue that took place in this pandemic. We'll do one more. So if we go on to the next slide. Another one is to do with cost-benefit analysis again, but a different kind of case study. So for many months during the pandemic, if we go on to the next slide, companies were producing these cheap, rapid, at-home COVID antigen tests that, a bit like a pregnancy test, can tell someone whether they're infected in just 15 or 20 minutes or so. But for a long time, the federal government and the FDA didn't approve these tests for domestic use. And even when they did, there were often restrictions that made them expensive or difficult to get, such as requiring a prescription to be able to access them and buy them. It's only relatively recently that these have been easily available over the counter in many places. Now, why is this? Why regulate these tests in this way? Well, one reason is that the FDA judged the tests according to the standards that they would other diagnostic tests for medical conditions. That means they set sensitivity thresholds for detecting positive cases that were pretty high. And that's understandable to a degree. It's because the regulations were designed to judge tests' accuracy in detecting disease. And when you're detecting disease with the potential to act on it with medical treatment, it obviously helps quite a lot for those tests to be accurate in detecting positives. In other words, to not generate too many false negatives. But what's using that same regulatory framework wise during this pandemic for these particular tests? If we go on to the next slide, one way economists think a little differently from politicians and some public health regulators is that we're keen to ask the compared to what question. So ingrained within us is this idea of thinking about trade-offs and not making the perfect the enemy of the good. And when you think about this pandemic and the role that rapid testing could have played earlier, you realize that setting such high thresholds for sensitivity could actually be counterproductive. So the first reason for this is that we have to think about what would happen if the tests were not approved. So suppose somebody wakes up one day and they had a tickly throat after heavily drinking the night before. Is it just a result of overdoing it, or is it the onset of COVID-19? At that stage, someone might be willing to use a cheap rapid test at home, but they might not be willing to take a few hours to go and find a PCR test where they could then have to wait for the results for 1 or 2 days. In fact, the alternative to having the rapid test available, I'd wager for many people, at least in their home settings, might just be taking their own temperature using a thermometer, or else just seeing how they feel through the day, which of course is much less accurate in terms of its sensitivity than the rapid tests. So the first lesson, I think, is that we shouldn't judge the accuracy of the tests against PCR tests, because that isn't the relevant alternative that most people would face or use in reality. And that's especially true given the fact that the rapid tests give a result quickly and give a positive result quickly, because of course, in that instance, one could still go and take a PCR test to confirm. So you're not really losing much by having these rapid tests available and out there. And that brings me to a second, I'd argue, the key point about thinking about the costs and benefits of this regulation. Because, yeah, in an ideal world, the rapid at-home tests would be as sensitive as the most state-of-the-art PCR tests, although arguably the PCR tests are sometimes too sensitive for what we care about, which is identifying someone when they're actually infectious to others. But looking at that one factor in isolation, the sensitivity of the test, ignores the clear benefits that the rapid tests had over the normal PCR tests in thinking about a testing regime. So firstly, they're incredibly cheap, both in terms of time and in terms of money. That means you can undertake them more regularly or repeatedly for any given testing budget, especially if you think the less sensitive test didn't pick up an actual infection, you have clear symptoms. Secondly, the fast turnaround time means that those who are believed to be infectious can actually isolate and tell their contacts to isolate much, much sooner than waiting 1 or 2 days with a PCR test. And that again helps reduce the transmission of the virus. And of course, that's ultimately what we care about. We cared about reducing the spread of the disease by trying to keep the transmission rate of this virus below 1. So there are a number of economists that thought about and modeled this a lot and actually concluded that cheap at-home rapid tests as part of a broader regime could have actually been extremely useful at keeping the transmission rate of the virus below 1 if they had been widely available and adopted. And even if we weren't in a position to have every household in the country testing regularly, as Nobel Prize winner Paul Romer proposed, clearly on the margin, these rapid tests could have helped much earlier in areas with big communal gatherings such as university dorms, certain workplaces and weddings. Indeed, there were some really successful case studies. Cornell University was really quickly able to slash the number of cases just with regular testing of their students. So these regulations unfortunately reduce the possibility of a relatively low-cost way of mitigating the disease because of the tightness of the sensitivity thresholds. And of course, these tests aren't a meaningful, harmful risk to anyone. We were treating them as if they were a crucial diagnostic tool that were helping to inform us make life or death decisions. But in reality, they were simply a practical health status check. So once you start thinking about the applications of economics to different decisions, it's quite difficult to stop. Whether it's the debate over mask wearing or whether the pandemic proves the need for less dependence on foreign medical supplies through trade, I'd argue that economists have an awful lot to say about all of these issues. And I hope that in giving you a flavour of the book, I hope I didn't bore you with presenting all the detailed evidence here. There's much more to find in the book. But my intention really isn't to ram my views down your throat, but to hopefully provide the tools such that you can think about the crisis as a good, well-trained economist would. So I hope this has been interesting so far. I recognise I'm a few minutes over time, and I look forward to taking a few different questions.
Just real quickly for our audience, while you all in the audience type questions into the chat box, could you tell us, what do you think the best decision that was made was in response to the virus by government authorities, and what was the absolute worst decision that you thought was made?
Well, that's a great question. That was a great question. I think that look, we can talk about the extent to which it helped. We recognized that quite early on, we'd got into a position where we produced a vaccine that was highly efficacious within a few weeks of recognizing the risk of this virus. And of course, we can always bemoan that it then took a long time to go through the trials and to get that vaccine out. But I think probably the best decision that the federal government made in terms of committing resources or time was to fund the Operation Warp Speed. And the reason that I say that is because the ongoing costs of the pandemic, both in terms of lost economic activity, yes, but also lost liberties and people being unable to live their lives in the way that they saw fit, those costs were so monumental and so large that that speeding up the process of getting vaccines out, even if it was just by a few weeks, meant that it was worth investing modest sums in trying to accelerate that process. So I'd say in terms of things that probably clearly passed the cost-benefit test, I think Operation Warp Speed was one of them. We could have gone further if we'd have had things like human challenge trials where people who are willing to be paid to accept the risk of being engaged in a vaccine trial in controlled conditions. That could have sped the process up even more. Unfortunately, we didn't do things like that, and that would have passed the cost-benefit test too. But Operation Warp Speed, I think there was a lot of good economics, good economic thinking behind it. In terms of the worst mistake, I actually think it was the original sin of the pandemic in terms of our response was the FDA's emergency use authorization regulations slowing down the rollout of initial diagnostic testing. They introduced new regulations that meant that labs that were ordinarily able to undertake their own diagnostic tests suddenly had to go through a process of submitting paperwork to the government, committing quite significant resources to that. It took a bit of time to do. There were mess ups in terms of not allowing certain labs to undertake that. And the CDC process was just CDC and FDA process was set up to go through all of these different hurdles, which actually delayed the rollout of diagnostic tests. And why was that important? Well, at that stage of the pandemic, as a result of there being so few tests available, meant we didn't know who was infected with the virus. And we didn't even know at that stage the areas of the country that were most affected by the virus. And as a result of that, when the demands came to undertake drastic action to stop the spread of this virus, especially after the outbreak in New York, it meant we couldn't do things that were much more targeted in terms of the areas of the country that were most affected at that time. We had to, in essence, act as if everybody potentially might be infected by the virus, and every area was as risky as any other area. And as a result of that, we of course imposed a lot of economic damage because we closed things that were relatively low risk. We probably ended up going much further in terms of the restrictedness of lockdowns in that first spring than we otherwise would. And an inability to kind of track who was getting infected early on also meant that we had much less of a good idea at that stage how this was spreading, right? It was obvious later on when you're able to track, okay, 30 people called it a wedding where people were singing and projecting these particles through the air. Perhaps doing that is a bad idea. We didn't know that last spring. And I think that all comes back to the original sin of testing. And it didn't have, I know that I'm going on, but it didn't have to be that way. The first recorded cases of the virus occurred at a similar time in the US and South Korea. And South Korea, the South Korean government, which had some dalliance with SARS and MERS, pulled in all of the private sector producers and said, this could be a problem. You know, we've got the information about this disease. Can you produce us as many tests as possible, as quickly as possible? And they really streamlined the approval process. And they were running vastly larger numbers of tests than the US was early on. You know, orders of magnitude, hundreds to thousands times more.
Okay, so the first question from the audience is from David, and it's about the value of a statistical life, which he asks, in aggregate and in the lost value of economic activity, these seem to be estimates based on estimates, which means that they come with some sort of error bars, so to speak. How can we refine that comparison to give additional insight? Is there a way to do that, you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that is difficult about this whole experience as a libertarian is one of the things that we drum into people from as far as we can is the importance of subjective valuations. We all have we all place completely different valuations on things in our lives. Personally, you know, wearing a mask to me seems a relatively low cost thing to do. I was covering my mouth when I was going to the supermarket even before mask mandates came in. But I know for a lot of other people, particularly people who, you know, might be deaf, for example, and rely on lip reading, young kids who are in schools and picking up those kind of those cues from facial movements, those things can be incredibly costly. So necessarily when you're using things like the value of a statistical life, you are aggregating and averaging across a population. And that means you lose a lot of useful information about how different groups or how different individuals value things. What I would say, though, is that when you're addressing a pandemic like this, and if we agree that there is a role for government in a pandemic, when you're kind of making decisions, you have to have some sort of way of balancing the costs and benefits. And I think what we could have done much better is try to break down that kind of value of a statistical life into different demographic groups. When it became obvious that the risk factors were so different by demographics, especially, but also by kind of vulnerability through kind of health status as well. And there are studies that seek to ascertain the willingness of older people, for example, to pay or to be paid to bear or remove particular risks. And I think the economists that just took the simple estimates from labour market studies and came out with all these crazy high numbers about the benefits of lockdowns were highly misguided and actually skewed the debate. I actually think on breaking down the components of lockdowns into their constituent parts, there were certain things that were much less likely on an individual basis to pass a cost-benefit analysis than others. And we lost that information because there were people out there waving around these huge numbers that meant that, you know, we didn't get to that part of the debate.
Okay, the next question is from Brishley. and it's really kind of a two-parter. She wants to know what your opinion is on the stimulus checks in terms of helping society or worsening the economy. And then related to that, how long do you think it'll be before the global logistics get back to anything approaching normal? Easy questions, right?
That's great questions. So governments around the Western governments, especially that did lock down and had the ability to engage in huge relief programs, tended to do one of two things. And the US did a bit of both, but just simplify for a second. They tended to either to support individuals by sending out, the stimulus checks, unemployment insurance benefits to individual people, and then a lot of the governments in Europe instead focused on, in effect, subsidizing the continuation of employer-employee relationships by keeping people attached to jobs through they call them like furlough schemes, in essence, where people would be paid to stay at home and not work, but their employer would have to continue employing them until the economy reopened. And there are clearly massive costs and benefits to each of those routes. The US one inevitably leads to a big spike in observable unemployment straight away, because as firms shut down, a lot of them did lay off workers, especially those that weren't able to obtain PPP loans or whatever. They did lay off workers, and as a result, we saw a much bigger spike than in Europe in the unemployment rate. The benefit, though, is that none of us really know what the economy is going to look like in the longer term. And it may well be, as seems to be the case, that coming out of this pandemic, we don't go back to normal. If by normal you mean the demand patterns, the work patterns, the working from home patterns that we saw in February 2020. And if that's the case, then it could well be true that a lot of these efforts to maintain employer-employee relationships ends up gumming up the economy and slowing down that adjustment to whatever new normal we're aiming towards. So how does this relate to? I think that clearly the stimulus checks have resulted in really robust demand growth. Unfortunately, I think policymakers didn't realize just the extent to which a pandemic which tears all these relationships up would impair the supply side of the economy. And, Larry Summers earlier on this year, former Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, was warning President Biden and Democrats in Congress that another big round of stimulus checks, including relief, including stimulus checks and big unemployment insurance benefits, could be very damaging, both because it would stimulate demand at a time when supply wasn't ready, leading to higher price inflation. And at the same time, those massive benefits could actually undermine the supply response of the economy by slowing down the willingness of workers to take up new jobs, or heightening the wage that employers would have to pay to attract them to particular roles. And I think that's broadly what we've seen. Of course, the stimulus checks and the unemployment insurance benefits aren't the whole story. Clearly, there are many people that don't want to go back to particular roles because they're worried about the risks of the virus, or because they've had a change of heart about what they want to do with the career. But on the margins, economics would suggest that the extent of stimulus that we've seen both led to demands that supply couldn't meet, and actually might have even worsened supply as a result of deterring job movement. And I think that's broadly right.
Okay, the next question is from Christine, and you kind of answered part of her question, so I'll ask kind of the second part, which is, has the economy changed permanently from this, do you think?
I think certain aspects clearly have. I mean, at the moment, we're still seeing, one of the reasons we're seeing supply chain problems at the moment is because, well, let me put it another way. In many sectors, not all, but in many sectors, suppliers are supplying as much as they ever have. It's just the fact that demand is so much higher than they were expecting. And so far, we are seeing that. We're seeing a much stickier demand for goods, a kind of shift from services to goods demand. And whether that will unwind or not, I'm not sure. We're going to go through a period of long adjustment. I do think the area which will probably change more, because we were kind of moving in that direction anyway, so it kind of accelerates an existing trend, is with remote working. I don't think that there'll be many companies that move to fully remote working, because there are big downsides to it. When you hire new employees, it's incredibly difficult to both track activity, but also to inculcate an individual in a corporate culture, get them to build close relationships with team members if you're never meeting in person. But I think it could well be the case that we kind of move in aggregate to a more kind of hybrid model, where individuals who were previously office workers tend to move to working in the office 2 to 3 days a week, and then at home for 2 to 3 days. Now, that of course has big economic effects, because if all of a sudden you're reducing demands in associated service industries in inner cities, sandwich shops, barbers and hairdressers and entertainment outlets and all of these things, if you're reducing permanently demand in those areas by 20 to 40%, you're going to see over time, you'll see a big shift in the spatial layout of where economic activity occurs. So I guess my answer is, we don't know the full extent of the changes yet, but I imagine, particularly on the supply side of the economy, that some of these changes will prove sticky.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and this is from Christine again. She said, do you have any thoughts on hospitals requiring nurses to have the COVID vaccine, or firing them when they desperately need nurses right now? And I guess that also addresses issue of vaccine mandates.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not in favor of government vaccine mandates, because I think we're in a completely different stage of the pandemic now. Individuals have had months and months and months, I believe 4 or 5 months, in order to get the vaccine. And as a result of that, the majority of the risks that still exist, not all, but the majority of the risks that still exist, are to individuals who've decided not to get the vaccine. Now, evidently, there's still a risk that you, even if you're vaccinated, that you might transmit this to other people, and there are certain individuals that are extremely vulnerable. But I think there are lower cost ways at this stage of providing vulnerable people, whether it be dishing out masks to them, rolling out deliberate, like, rapid testing at the door of hospitals and care homes and things like that. There are certain things that we could do to mitigate risks in a way that wouldn't require the heavy-handedness of mandates. The other thing that I would say on this is that it makes no sense to me medically to impose a mandate that doesn't incorporate the immunity one gets from having had a COVID-19 infection. So to the extent that employers are mandating that individuals get vaccines, but not taking into consideration that people might have observable antibodies from having been infected, I think that's misguided. On hospitals, look, this is a high risk virus to vulnerable people and elderly people who tend to occupy lots of hospitals. And I think in private hospitals, in hospitals generally, they're privately within their rights, I think, to require that if somebody is going to operate there, that they take the measures that the hospital administrators consider necessary to keep their patients safe. And if there were things that I were doing at my job at CATO that endangered CATO donors or participants in events, I'd probably be quickly fired too. So I'm opposed to a blanket mandate imposed by the federal government, but I can understand why individual hospitals might want to mandate this.
Well, thank you, Ryan. And I would like to hold up the book for everybody. You can see it behind his shoulder there, Economics in One Virus, an Introduction to Economic Reasoning Through COVID-19. I'd like to recommend that people buy it and read it and think about and reason how they might reason differently as a result of reading the book. Thank you so much for today. We appreciate it, Ryan.
Great to be with you.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.